Let's take a look at the esophagus now, otherwise known as the food tube. So there's no digestion that happens here in the esophagus. The esophagus simply connects the oral cavity and the oropharynx back here with the stomach. It's simply a hollow tube, and the esophagus very normally is collapsed. There's no reason for it to stay open. Contrary to the trachea is in front of the esophagus. It's anterior to the esophagus. In this diagram here, you can see the trachea here. Here's the esophagus posteriorly, and there's no reason for the esophagus to stay open all the time. Versus the trachea, it needs to stay open to get air in and out, and it does so because of the cartilaginous rings that keep it open, the C-shaped rings. So the esophagus proximally, because remember we can use words proximal and distal with regards to not only extremities, arms and legs, but also tubes within the body. So the proximal esophagus is the start, the distal esophagus is the end down here. So the proximal esophagus, there is a sphincter, a ring of circular muscles that's located, that's called the upper esophageal sphincter. Distally, there's the lower esophageal sphincter, which guards the entrance to the stomach. So when you swallow food, the sphincters open up. And we're going to go over swallowing food in a minute and how food moves down your esophagus, because it actually is an active process. Doesn't happen passively. You have no control over it. It's involuntary, but there is a lot of nuances. Okay. So one of the things that we want to talk about briefly is stomach acids. So down here at the distal end where you have the lower esophageal sphincter, that sphincter is normally closed until you swallow food. Once you swallow food, it opens up briefly to allow the food into the stomach, and then it closes again. It's important that it stays shut when you're not swallowing food. Otherwise, stomach acids would splash up into your distal esophagus, and we call that heartburn, or GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. So it's important that we keep an eye on GERD for a couple different reasons. But let's backtrack here for a minute. So, for example, when you used to hang from the monkey bars upside down in elementary school, or when you do cartwheels or handstands, the reason that your stomach contents don't come splashing out of your mouth and your nose is because of that lower esophageal sphincter. So there are some conditions where that sphincter is loosened and allows stomach acids to splash up in your esophagus, and it will over time erode your esophagus. Stomach acids have a pH of around 1 to 2. That's very, very corrosive. It's very acidic. And the esophagus cannot handle that amount of acid. So when the acid does splash up, it will start to erode through the esophagus, and over time becomes painful. And if it erodes enough, remember there are 4 layers of the alimentary canal. If it erodes through and pierces or erodes through a blood vessel, whether it's a vein or an artery, you will then have bleeding. And now we have a bleeding ulcer, but from your esophagus, not from your stomach. We'll learn about stomach ulcers in a little bit. So that's quite dangerous. It is a life-threatening condition. And also, I'm not sure why, but uncontrolled GERD, uncontrolled gastroesophageal reflux disease, is associated with a higher than normal incidence of esophageal cancer. So folks with heartburn should be screened, should be watched, and particular attention should be paid to how often you have heartburn, and keep it under control. You can keep heartburn under control for in a variety of ways. You can simply pop something like Tums or Rolaids, which are alkaline. They're antacids. They'll neutralize your stomach acid. But for the longer run, you may need to be put on acid controllers like Pepsid AC. AC is acid control, or what we call proton pump inhibitors. Remember, an H+, the more H pluses you have, the higher concentration of H+, the lower the pH, the more acidic. Well, H pluses are protons. Remember, the hydrogen atom itself has 1 proton, 1 electron, no neutrons. So if you take that electron away from a hydrogen atom, you're left with H+. If you take an electron away from an electron and a proton, all you're left with is a proton. So this is why H pluses are called protons. And people like me are on PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. We'll learn in the next segment, next video, about stomach acids and how you produce stomach acids. But if you're on PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, we prevent the stomach from producing as much H pluses. So that's as far as the esophagus goes, the structure of the esophagus. As far as swallowing goes, we call this peristalsis. So you can think of it as a boa constrictor swallowing its prey whole. So after it squishes it and suffocates it, it swallows its prey whole. And the way it does that is the distal muscles relax, whereas the proximal muscles, especially the circular ones, because remember, there are circular muscles and longitudinal muscles that line your alimentary canal. So if the distal muscles relax and the proximal muscles constrict, you will end up pushing that food bolus. Remember, that ball of food is called a food bolus. Down, 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 down. And it is an active activity. You have no control over it. It's involuntary. However, it is an activity that needs to occur. You can actually, if you, it's an interesting exercise. If you want to do a handstand, and if you can do a handstand, if you can swallow some water, put some water in your mouth, but actually don't swallow it yet. Do the handstand. So now you're upside down, swallow that water, see if it's possible for the water to go up against gravity down your esophagus. So this is what we call peristalsis. It's the movement of food because of the muscles from one end of the food tube to the other end. And here is the act of swallowing. There are a couple different phases. There is one voluntary phase where you have that food bolus and you start to swallow the food. And then the involuntary phases take over and peristalsis takes over, and the food ends up going through the lower esophageal sphincter into your stomach.